use this virtual format for the IHR, the Institute of Historical Research, Transport and Mobility History seminars. We will be recording the session, so if anyone is concerned about that, please disappear now or forever hold your peace. The plan is to record Jodie's presentation, but not the Q&A, so you won't live on in infamy. Could we, obviously you're all very welcome, could we just remind you as well to, particularly during Jodie's presentation, to keep the mics muted. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and as you might have heard, you can use the chat function during the presentation if you wish. There is also at the bottom of your screens, hopefully you'll have a little thing saying participants. There's a if you open it up, there's a raise hand function in there, so when it comes to get down at the bottom of the list of participants, so when it comes to Q&A, I'll do my best to keep an eye on things, but do use that and I will try and get to you in turn. Before we get on to Jodie's presentation today, could I quickly plug the next session whilst we got you here and attentive, which will be on Thursday 12th of November, also at 5:30 p.m. Chris Ewers from the University of Exeter will be talking to the title Mobility and the Sentence. So he'll be looking at the links between history, literary studies and mobility studies, particularly drawing upon descriptions of travel in a variety of modes. So do please join us for that. We'll send out reminders and so on in the fullness of time.
The link is in the chat now.
Oh, perfect, thanks Charlotte. Yep, that's great. So you can find the details there and sign up if you haven't already done so in the chat. However, tonight I am very pleased to welcome Jodie Matthews from the University of Huddersfield. She's a reader in English literature there and an honorary research fellow with the Canal and River Trust. Her research focuses on the history and cultures of Britain's waterways from the 18th century to the present, including in particular experiences of people moving on water in the 19th century. She's worked on a variety of other topics as well, some of which she drew together in her 2018 book, The Gypsy Woman, Representations in Literature and Visual Culture. She has recently produced a literature review for the Canal and River Trust on the connections between Britain's waterways and the transatlantic slave trade in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So very, very pertinent and important work. Tonight, we'll be hearing about Colonizing Canal-Land, Adventurers, Empire and the British Waterways. Jodie, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you. And hopefully, can everybody see that? Is that working? Fab, okay. Volume wise, how's that sounding? Can everybody hear me at that volume? Perfect, okay. So, some of the text that I'm going to talk about, seeing the names popping up in front of me, some of you may know these texts already, so I'd be really intrigued to hear your take on these as well. In October 1899, the Boy's Own paper published Vincent Hughes's account of voyaging with a friend named Jackie through Canal-Land in a Canadian canoe. So that's where the Canal-Land of my title comes from. They had acquired a light and well-built canoe, and thanks to a friend at the Grand Junction Canal Company, obtained the requisite passes to travel from the Thames at Brentford to Kendal in Westmoreland. They were delayed at the first lock by a string of canal barges coming through to catch the morning tide. And that rather sets the tone, because the actual work of the canals is often seen by them as an annoying disturbance to their adventure. And to get a sense of the publishing context of this travelogue, one can look at the articles published alongside it in the collected annual volume of the Boy's Own paper for 1899. It opens with the imagined daring exploits of a young Robert Clive, not yet of India. Later, there are interviews with Thomas Hayward of the Surrey 11 and the Australian Clement Hill, champion batsmen. There's an illustration of alligator shooting in Florida and accounts of 1,000 days in the Arctic, an Indian conjurer on the Mediterranean station in Malta, and the longest bicycle ride ever attempted. There's advice on things like tenting as a holiday for boys. Through Canal-Land in a Canadian canoe thus finds itself at the confluence of sport, exploration, and empire. Explicitly, an article by Henry C. Devine about roughing it on the Thames asserts that British boys anxious to rough it have no need to wait until they can outspan trek and lager on the South African veldt, shoot elephant in Burma, or bivouac on the Andes in a blizzard, because all these little luxuries, with the exception of the elephant, if Barnum's is nowhere about, can be got in their own country. Adventures, hardships, and hairbreadth escapes galore may be picked up like blackberries if one has the pluck and grit associated with the name of Englishman. In other words, in the later 19th century, the narratives of colonial adventure were explicitly being turned geographically inwards to the British Isles. And this is not startling insight for any of you who are scholars of colonial discourse, but I'm interested here in the way this works specifically in relation to the canals and waterways of the UK. My contention in this paper is that what Hughes does, along with two other authors of travelogues, one of which is ostensibly fictionalised but based on a real journey, is transform the canals into a space for physical and ideological conquest, turning Britain into a newly discoverable land. And I'm blending factual accounts and pseudo-fiction, which I think is methodologically legitimate in relation to this type of writing and the period that I'm examining, because as Justin Livingston has pointed out, in the closing decades of the 19th century, there was a concerted tendency among the celebrated explorers of Africa to publish novels alongside the authoritative expeditionary narrative. Indeed, he goes on, in travel literature, the ambiguous boundary between fact and fiction is arguably thrown into particularly sharp relief. In their descriptions, the writers I examine here depict the working class people they meet as native others. The authors repeat, replicate, and resituate imperialist discourse in their approach to the British working class people on and near the waterways. I'm going to begin with Hughes's text because it's a really clear example of that happening. Then I'm going to look at another earlier work, Stockman's A Trip Through the Caledonian Canal from 1861, which was privately published. And then finally, I'm going to think about consuming the exotic in this micro-genre via Sarah Jeanette Duncan's Two Girls on a Barge. And I've been circling around these texts for a few years now. Some of you may have heard me talk about them before, as I've been thinking about the changing meaning of Britain's canals. So today's a really welcome opportunity to think a little bit about them again and gather some thoughts and insight from the audience. And by way of conclusion, I want to push beyond simply demonstrating or tutting at the presence of imperial discourse at home within the British Isles and push on to think of the implications of these observations for rereading the histories of our canals and waterways trans-historically in the light of contemporary politics and circumstances. In other words, we were saying just before we started the talk actually, the 19th century is an escape from everything that's going on at the moment is quite a nice thing. And I joked that the 19th century is the same as it ever was, but actually in this paper, I'm suggesting it's not, it's constantly changing. So Hughes and his friend in Canal-Land are somewhere between adventurers, explorers and sportsmen. And I personally think they're very brave, not because of the exploring that they're doing, but because they daily take an invigorating swim in the polluted canals that they're paddling along. What I don't want to do is smooth out the difference between what Hughes does and what imperial canoeist explorers, such as the ill-fortuned C.H. Coulthurst, and what they undertook. Exploration was, as Dane Kennedy reminds us, a distinct and rigorous enterprise with its own epistemological logic and codes of conduct. Neither was Hughes the first to do anything like this. He travels in the wake of the father of modern canoeing, John MacGregor. Nevertheless, this is how Hughes wishes to be seen. The opening of the narrative describes wanting to look for new experience, variety as the spice of existence, but also wanting to explore comparatively unknown canals. They're unknown, of course, to men of their class and experience, but not to the men and women who daily worked on them. Hughes points out where they have achieved exploratory firsts, and an example of that would be they claim they were the first canoe to paddle across the bridge by which the Bridgewater Canal is carried over the Manchester Ship Canal. And I probably wouldn't be that keen to do it myself, but he's very keen to talk about the fact that this is the first canoe to go over there. The adventuring of this type didn't end in the 19th century either. In 1933, William Bliss published a canoeing chronicle at the heart of England. And professional stuntman Paul Lowe's canoe adventure is very 2020. He decided during lockdown that he needed a project to plan. And so he planned it, and then once restrictions were released a bit, he kayaked all the way down the English canal system from the Lake District to London. And he was the first person, he claims, to do this entirely unassisted, and it took 10 days. His thoughts on the 21st century adventuring is that adventure doesn't necessarily mean setting yourself some intense challenge. It can mean exploring somewhere new. And I think this relates back to what Hughes was doing. He was investigating the possibilities for remaking the English waterways as somewhere new. Hughes knew he would have a ready audience if his canal narrative was framed as exploration into unknown territory. David Livingstone's missionary travels and researches in South Africa from 1857, for instance, sold more than 70,000 copies and made a profit of over £12,000 for its author. And as we've seen, the travelogue fits in with the expectations of readers in the boy's own paper. Changing reading habits and developments in print culture in the later 19th century meant that explorers of Africa were celebrities. The canal explorers discussed here are aware of that fame. They don't assume to reach its dizzy heights. In many ways, the form and content of these narratives continue the tradition of ship's logs and explorers' diaries, but more specifically the African explorer texts of the 1860s to the 1880s. By the time Hughes and indeed the other two authors discussed in this paper were writing, the canals were ripe for rediscovery. They held, of course, a very different place in the nation's industrial system than they had at the beginning of the 19th century. James Stephen James noted in 1890 that the railway system has been extended so rapidly and has secured the carrying trade of the country so completely that canals have until lately been regarded as practically obsolete and useless. Many miles of canal navigation have passed into the hands of the railway companies, while a considerable mileage has become derelict. Canals as they were built a century ago have no longer any function to fulfill that is worthy of serious consideration. Their mission is ended. Their use is an anachronism. And these authors certainly paint those engaged in the carrying trade as quaint anachronisms, as other writers did travelling Romany people and show people in the period. But they also show that the canals need not only be thought about in relation to their original use. These aren't journeys without maps, to quote Graham Greene, but an exercise in ideologically remapping the dark industrial interior of the country. At Hanwell, still known for its flight of locks, the canoeists had a brief chat with an old bargee, from whom we got some useful advice, patronisingly described as not wholly free from chaff. At the Blissworth Tunnel, they make use of a tug. The journey through this subterranean passage was a most novel one to us who had never been through a tunnel of this description before. The intense darkness, only illuminated by the light from the boiler fire, was most uncanny, while the wonderful reverberations and echoes occurring in the tunnel quite startled us until we became used to the situation. The roof seemed so low that we instinctively stooped our heads to avoid getting them removed from our shoulders, an action which caused immense amusement to the skipper, who in the manner of his kind accentuated the eerie feeling of the place by spinning all sorts of creepy yarns about canal boatmen who had mysteriously gone overboard in the pitch dark and never been seen again. So the canal is a home territory deliberately being made strange to accentuate the adventure. Kennedy again notes that it became possible in the 19th century to explore territory that was not truly terra incognita to the explorers or their sponsors. Their aim was to discover the known and new. But I'm keen to pick up on here the adventurer's relationship to the people of the waterways on whom their journey relies. Because in addition to the assistance that I've just described getting through the tunnel, the pair get a tow to Stone in Staffordshire from a monkey barge, that's a narrow boat with a living space, and they avoid having to go dangerously through another tunnel in their canoes with the aid of a man, a boy and a wheelbarrow. On the Lancaster Canal, all barges are cleared out of their way to offer them a smooth journey. At Kendal, they obtain the assistance of a man with a horse and cart to take the canoe and their luggage to Kendal Station. Fairly recent research, such as that done by Felix Driver and Lowry Jones, has drawn attention to the previously hidden histories of exploration, emphasising the contributions of indigenous peoples that made European expeditions possible. And I suggest that these floating domestic travelogues might contribute nuance to our understanding of hidden histories elsewhere in exploration literature. Conish, Nugent and Shellam explain that the focus on mediators in the story of exploration works against a conventional emphasis on the exploits and achievements of the singular heroic explorer, meaning that imperial and colonial exploration is recast as a collective enterprise involving a diverse labour force and upon which expeditions were dependent for their progress and success. These practices of mediation bring about cross-cultural encounters and exchange, even if, in this instance, the privileged white males don't seem very open to what they might learn from their waterway mediators. The few writings from this period that do give canal boat people an authentic voice demonstrate that there would have been plenty to learn, had the canoeists only been prepared to listen. Felix Driver hopefully suggests that, seen in this way, we might acquire a wider conception of exploration knowledge as co-produced. Hughes, the author and canoeist, doesn't see it this way, but 21st century readers might when we reread these texts. Driver goes on, the figure of the intermediary, or the go-between, seemed to offer a fruitful way of investigating the ways in which knowledge of geography, natural history and ethnography actually gets translated in the process of exploration. And I haven't got time to fully unpack that here, but I think it offers a fruitful way of thinking about this micro-genre, what I'm calling the floating domestic travelogue, in more detail. As Kennedy adds, local and indigenous knowledge was also undervalued within global explorer narratives, but vital to the success of exploration. So I'm reasserting that all these intermediaries, these mediators, these go-betweens that the explorers require on the waterways are very much undervalued in these narratives. There's one incident in particular in Through Canal-Land in a Canadian Canoe on which I'd like to spend a bit more time, and it comes when the journey reaches the industrial north from where I speak. So, during the rest of the day's paddle, we were in the very heart of the coal mining district, and our progress caused no little comment and wonder to the crowds of locked out miners and their families. So embarrassing became their attentions at length that we had to abandon our original intention of landing at Wigan, owing to the numerous crowd awaiting our approach at that place. Twice we essayed to get ashore, but finally, not appreciating the appearance of the motley crowd, we pushed on until we reached Plank Lane, where, the crowd of idlers being a little less dense, we summoned up pluck enough to venture ashore. Even here we found ourselves the centre of attraction to the people, rough miners crowding around us as we lifted our canoe from the water to stare in amazement at our appearance, even going so far in their admiration of our little craft as to pass their hands along its polished sides, all the while expressing their opinions in such a broad vernacular as to be almost unintelligible to our southern ears. They thought it was a joke upon our part when we told them that we had paddled all the way from London in the canoe. The way they nudged each other and winked solemnly was most expressive. Their attentions at last became so overwhelming that we were compelled to give the craft into the care of the friendly lockkeeper and beat a hasty retreat. The Leeds-Liverpool Canal, on the banks of which this incident occurred, gave Wigan easy access for the first time to a major port, though by the time Hughes and Jackie visited, there were 3 railway stations in the town. Factories and mills were built alongside the canal, changing Wigan into a manufacturing centre, with horse-drawn boats covering the distance to Liverpool in 12 hours or so. Most local collieries already had horse-drawn tramways to move coal from the pitheads, which were extended fairly easily to the canal side. Coal was, of course, the essential fuel for a range of local industries, as well as being exported. So it was used from brass working to glass making. Industrial relations in the town were acrimonious throughout the second half of the 19th century, and the sight of locked-out miners was not particularly unusual. Miners were not treated as employees, but more like what we'd call 0 hours contractors today, receiving a small amount per tonne of coal mined. This was, of course, dangerous work. Explosions at Arley Pit in the 1850s killed tens of men and boys at a time. When the miners' requests to increase the amount paid per tonne was turned down, they withdrew their labour. And this, I've grabbed this photo from John Hanby's Historic Wigan, and this is of the 1893 strike. When the demands for more money were met, as they were in 1890, the price of coals ramped up so that to the consumer, and the mine owners actually made more profits after this change in wages. 1893's coal strike, seen here, saw the Hull Daily Mail riff on the saying about sending coals to Newcastle. Scottish coal was being imported to Liverpool and sent to Wigan. Strikes were not only about the price per tonne. In 1895, the Garswood Hall Colliery Company tried to impose a more difficult method for extracting coal, which was tantamount to a reduction in wages, as the miners insisted tonnage would be lower. In such strikes, hundreds, if not thousands, of miners would be locked out at a time. It was up to 5,000 during a strike in 1894. So the crowd that the canoeists witnessed would certainly have been large and not a little intimidating. The newspapers of the time give accounts of the industrial disputes, but there's no attempt in Hughes's narrative to even humanise the striking miners. And it's quite important to see an image like this, I think, a photograph from the period, because Hughes might as well be talking about something and some people very different. Hughes and Jackie actually consume the strike as yet another form of privileged adventure, because they're also given a tour of the deserted mine, and they just kind of talk about how spooky it is because it's empty and dark. The very worst that the miners do to the canoeists is touch the boat and show wonder at the adventure, yet Hughes and Jackie are too frightened to come ashore. Perhaps they have in mind the 1886 death of Austrian Karl Hinkelmann in present-day Mozambique, 14 days' journey from the River Shire at the hands of a native chief. Hinkelmann's young English companion escaped to tell the tale, and his story was, of course, immediately believed, though unverified. Maybe they read of the Reverend George Grenfell of Birmingham, who experienced savage hostility as he passed up a new river in the course of his exploration of African waterways. But Hughes and Jackie lack the missionary zeal to win their audience's trust, as did Grenfell. Perhaps the news reported in the 1880s of the territories Stanley was heroically claiming were at the forefront of their imagination, and the tales of dangerous German and Spanish encounters with the natives from the river. In other words, for the canoeist fashioning himself as an explorer in the 1890s, a bank of curious natives, in inverted commas, was probably something to be nervous about. Hughes translates that nervousness into narrative, and his countrymen become inarticulate, strange, incredulous, motley. While this latter adjective, motley, is a depreciative reference to a diverse or varied group, the etymology of the word is from the parti-coloured coat of a fool in the 16th and 17th century. Hughes makes fools of the striking workers in his attempt to position himself as the brave adventurer. Such voyages were not, of course, the preserve of the British waterways. William Mowens published his account of an 1869 trip through France and Belgium on a steam yacht, and this was produced not just as entertainment, but as a guide, because at the end he appends kilometric distances from place to place. And he actually presents that travel as an anti-adventure because travelling by canal, you can avoid seasickness, and it allays the awful fears that the slightest occurrence raises in the minds of many of our lady yachters when they're on anything rougher than a canal. The bureaucracy of these journeys is a generic constant across this microgenre. Mowens, for instance, mentions the yellow laissez-passer stamped and signed at the Bureau de la Navigation. They actually lose that precious document at one point and have to purchase a replacement for 1 penny. So despite that tameness, the anticipated readership is clearly supposed to understand this as a novel type of voyage and therefore exploratory, because travel literature is actually advertised at the back of that book. For instance, C.J. Anderson's Notes of Travel in South Africa. More famously, Robert Louis Stevenson recounted his inland voyage via canoe with Sir Walter Grindley Simpson in 1876 from Antwerp through Belgium and into France towards Paris. And Stevenson paints a very romantic picture in spite of being spat on by children from a bridge on part of the journey. And the pair canoeing in that case meet kindred spirits in the Royal Sport Nautique. We were English boating men and the Belgian boating men fell upon our necks. It's a very interesting homosocial space, the canoeing club. The tone meanders from sporting interest to anthropological, as Stevenson asserts, echoing closely the sentiments of many writers at this time about the Romani people, which, as Mike mentioned, is another area of research interest for me. These canaletti are only gypsies semi-domesticated, he says, of canal boat people. So to move on now to another example from Britain, the author of A Trip Through the Caledonian Canal was hoping to admire the romantic Scottish scenery with friends and relations aboard a rather different craft than Hughes's canoe, the cutter Whipper, accompanied by another vessel, the Snapper. And these two names are obviously a joke, whippersnapper being a young, inexperienced and presumptuous person. The work isn't intended for a wide audience, so that sort of lame private joke is indicative of the expectation of a small and knowing readership. So it was privately printed and authored by somebody called Bumps, which was identified by the blogger Mick Vedmore as B.P. Stockman, who was personal assistant to the civil engineer George Robert Stevenson. There's a lot of Stevensons in this paper. And George Robert Stevenson was himself a keen yachtsman, and he seems to be the commodore of this tale. The trip happened at the behest and thanks to the funds of the commodore, and it may be that he wished to partly repeat the journey that he was embarked on but was uncompleted by his famous cousin, Robert Stevenson, shortly before his death in 1859, and from whom he inherited a considerable sum. This voyage, as described by Bumps, presents the Scottish waterways as a space for adventurous leisure, particularly for those who had done so much to literally engineer national industrial success. The narrator makes clear that much of the adventure appears in the travelogue by virtue of exaggeration, the actual journey having been monotonously and pertinaciously agreeable. The voyage does not commence in romantic scenery. Glasgow, for instance, although a magnificent city, is said to possess no particular attraction to the tourist. It is all commerce and manufacture. Indeed, the tourist will leave Glasgow as speedily as possible, perhaps a little disgusted. En route to Glasgow, the party stop at Newcastle, where one member of the group refers to the local dialect as infernal gibberish. This is no doubt another joke for a closed audience because this was where Stevenson was born, but the discursive effect is to play the working class speech for laughs and to make the observed locals as inarticulate as the miners in Hughes's work. Early in the journey, by water, a more appreciative but equally patronising view is in evidence. It was very amusing to watch the various faces filled with wonder of those waiting at the pierhead to see us land. Little urchins with heads like mops, ragged and short kilts and bare legs, standing with their mouths as well as their eyes wide open. But this free and easy costume was not peculiar to little children only, for there were many of the children of larger growth in almost aboriginal coverings. He adds that these figures demonstrated an attractive guilelessness. Innocent, amazed natives, noble savages. The narrator of A Trip Through the Caledonian Canal continues a long tradition of representing Scottish Highlanders as non-white others. See, for instance, Colin Galloway's 2008 monograph, White People, Indians and Highlanders, for a study of this. This is, of course, a continuation of the kind of discourse that had legitimised the Highland clearances, often seen from a post-colonial perspective in parallel with colonial policies beyond the British Isles. Consciously or not, for public consumption or not, this travelogue is utterly ingrained with discourses of empire, ownership, and the colonial gaze. Speaking of privilege, the voyages along the Caledonian Canal are very fond of luxury, roughing it only for very short periods. And also very keen on luxury are the two girls on a barge from V. Cecil Coates' 1891 work of that name. Coates is the pseudonym for Sarah Jeanette Duncan, and there's a tenuous connection with the previous text because Duncan's father was Scottish, though she herself was born in Canada. Around 20 years before she was born, the city in which she grew up, Brantford, saw a commercial boom thanks to the Grand River Navigation Canal, offering cheap water transport and access to world markets. Duncan was an assertive career woman, marching into newspaper editors' offices and demanding to be hired and wrangling invitations around the globe. There was one instance actually where she managed to get a job on the newspaper, but the editor wouldn't countenance having women in the newspaper offices, so she had to do as we're all doing and work from home. So she would somehow manage to get these invitations to all manner of glamorous places, or not so glamorous, around the world. She was a seemingly fearless traveller, and that attitude permeated her lightly fictionalised narratives. As one biography notes, the single woman, daring and adventuresome, who leaves her home to travel in search of new experiences, would preoccupy Duncan in 9 of her novels. For instance, in the hybrid A Social Departure, the narrator and companion take a train across Western Canada, a ship from Vancouver to Japan, then on to Ceylon, India, Suez, from whence by train to Cairo, then another trip to Britain via Brindisi, Malta and Gibraltar. Duncan's characters treat the world as their playground, their whiteness opening doors and offering security almost wherever they go. Following her engagement to Everard Charles Coates, whom she met at the Viceroy of India's residence and who proposed at Agra, the author went to stay with her prospective in-laws at Newington Rectory. And I think she must have found it deadly boring compared to the life she'd led so far, because during this stay, she embarked on the barge voyage, semi-fictionalised, in Two Girls on a Barge. So she was marooned in Britain and looked to find something matching her globe-trotting adventures on the English waterways. And the girls on the barge are, of course, women. And on a whim, they decide to undertake this holiday voyage by salt barge. And what I love about it is that the name of the salt barge is Industrious. And they've turned it from an industrial purpose to something else. And they go from Paddington to the birthplace of George Eliot. They concede that a man is a sort of necessity when there's carpentering to be done. So they're joined by the character they call the cadet as they convert the barge. And they deck it out with fairy lights, a Japanese umbrella and Liberty curtains, because little things make so much difference when you want to make a barge look picturesque. A friend lends them an artist, an embryo RA, provided we could persuade the gentleman of the advantages of a canal as an artistic field. Now, Duncan's biographer hasn't tracked down the party that made up Duncan's barge crew on the voyage from which this fiction emerges, but I think the artist on board was actually the well-known Victorian illustrator F.H. Townsend, who illustrated this and several other of Duncan's works. It's a bit of a jump, but I think putting them side by side, I think it may be the same person. He's quite unusual for not having a beard, actually, in the period. I haven't said much yet about the ways in which canal boat people in particular were racialised in 19th century depictions. But the most frequent comparison of canal boat workers, people living on canal boats, is with Romany people, the water gypsy being a common reference point. And I can see that the comparisons probably began because of the ideas about travelling life, but the comparisons go far beyond that, to the extent that many people today still understand there to be an ethnic relationship between canal boat people and Romany people, that there isn't an extensive link. Obviously, there are individuals who may have made the move from the land to the water, but it's by no means the same ethnicity. In Two Girls on a Barge, it's a bohemian aesthetic that grabs the women's attention. One barge in particular struck this note in us as we crossed lines with it. It was being drawn by a gypsy girl, rather a bargee girl with a gypsy face and a red kerchief on her head. It had a Neapolitan effect that we envied her. In fact, we attempted it ourselves, but our disadvantages outbalanced the effect. And their disadvantages are, of course, disingenuous because they're speaking from a position of enormous privilege when they play at being gypsy bargees. Exhibited here is the same exoticism that motivated, for instance, the Gypsy Law Society and many fictional versions of gorgeous men and women running off to join the gypsies. Like the Scottish Highlanders, Romany people have been interpreted in post-colonial scholarly readings, sometimes in a rather too straightforward way, as others within. A figure who connects representations of Britain's Romanys to canal boat people is the Victorian philanthropist George Smith of Colville, and he was obsessed, as I have written about and people may have heard me talk about before, with regulating the lives of travelling peoples in Britain. And he regularly deployed comparisons with African natives and called such lives beyond the pale. He actually appears as a character in Two Girls on a Barge, but with the name of Mr. Gershom. The women go with him to a gypsy camp. In a desolate spot near a village with their washtub and their caravans and all their Moorish-eyed babies. I must have read 100 similar descriptions of Romany camps from the 19th century. The women on the barge are conspicuous consumers of otherness, whether that's gypsy children or a bargee family. The adventurers here are even more reliant on intermediaries than was Hughes in his canoe. The narrator refers to our own bargee and Mrs. Bargee, without whom the Industrious, again the name of the barge, wouldn't even leave its mooring. Their vernacular speech, the bargees, is presented in a very patronising manner. The pronunciation of particular words leaks out of the quotation marks into the narrative in a way that's making fun of the speaker. And I'm tempted every time I read this narrative to rewrite it from the bargee's perspective. For my conclusion, I promise to think beyond this singular reading of the historical canal space as a site of privileged adventure, but to think more about practical, methodological and political implications of rereading the waterways. So this is one of these opening out conclusions rather than a nice summing up one, I'm afraid. I'm also aware that there are lots of loose ends in the paper, perhaps most urgently the complexities of mapping a European/indigenous relationship onto the British class structure of the later 19th century, and the comparison of representations of natives in colonised lands with that of ethnic others within Britain. This is subtle stuff that kind of needs time to unpick. However, to think about what the canal has meant is also to think about what matters today. To read Empire and Class into canal travelogues in the Decolonizing Academy, I won't say post-colonial academy because we're not there yet, is to be open to uncomfortable truths. Such a confrontation happened recently, as Mike noted in the introduction, when I was asked by the Canal and River Trust to undertake a literature review into the links between transatlantic slavery and the waterways, following the removal of a statue of a slave factor on Canal and River Trust land in the wake of Black Lives Matter demonstrations. The truth is, the proceeds of slavery were invested in the building of canals. The truth is, those canals moved slave-produced goods around the country, including cotton, rice, and sugar. The truth is, that story has not been fully told. because heritage organisations and the field of transport history are about as diverse as other institutions and academic fields in the humanities. In other words, not very. These are stories that it's been fairly easy to not tell over the years, though the early 2000s did see an appeal for history of transport researchers to pay attention to race as a fundamental category of analysis in their work. That was in the Journal of Transport History. For Kut and Zeiler, taking account of race provides an especially powerful optic on the 19th and 20th centuries in the industrialising democracies of Europe and North America. And in canal history, we would add the 18th century to that backwards look, though of course the concept of race as we inherit it today crystallised in the 19th century. Indeed, says Zeiler, the history of modern transport is inextricable from a history of race, and I'd suggest that we are still very much reckoning with that. Another route. In the 19th century, canal boat people were framed as vectors of disease as they travelled from place to place along a watercourse that was considered stinking and diseased. And I would argue, again, this is kind of takes slower and more careful explication than I've got time for, but I would argue that that was also partly racialised. The canals were certainly dirty, but these discourses reflected developments in and panic around germ theory and contagionism. And it's hard to see those kinds of descriptions today without thinking about the ways in which particular groups now are labelled super spreaders and that certain behaviours are seen as very risky. So taking the long view of the canal offers a reflection on contemporary epidemiological scapegoating. To take another turn, when we read the historical waterway today, we read from the perspective of climate crisis. Why think about the Anthropocene when we think about the canals? My short and perhaps facetious answer is, how can we think about anything else? Climate crisis is upon us, the end is nigh. The longer answer is that the conditions of the Anthropocene affect how we read about industry, fossil fuels, and power-shifting technological change in the past. Most of the canals flowing through my writing carried coal, or the materials and products of coal-fired processes. Industrial Britain ran on coal. Canals are uniquely implicated in developing industrial capitalism in Britain, and today we deal with the catastrophic consequences of that. In short, the work I undertake is not a minutely historicist return to the waterways of the past, though of course my research and interpretation relies on the accurate and detailed research of others. I'm very grateful to those scholars, and I'm aware of the debt with every word I write. But I'm interested in the ways in which the water keeps flowing, the meaning of the canals keeps changing, depending where we stand, to whom we listen, and our stake in that space.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Jodie. That was fascinating. Really interesting.